Is the Bud Light boycott the new Boston Tea Party? Hello, this is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government, dailytorch.com. Hit that subscribe button. Today, we're going to be talking about the Bud Light boycott in the wake of Bud Light and Anheuser-Busch using transgender activist Dylan Mulvaney to sell Bud Light or not sell it, depending on what your perspective is. During March Madness, there's been a lot of backlash from core demographics that typically purchase Anheuser-Busch products, and they are boycotting Bud Light right now. They're just saying, oh, we don't support this woke agenda. We're going to purchase something else instead. And it shows that the boycotts can be extremely effective at garnering attention for policies that are unpopular. And I wanted to talk about one of the most famous boycotts of all, which was the Boston Tea Party of 1773. It was one of the essential sparks in the days and years before the American Revolution, before 1776, that invariably led the road towards independence for the new nation. And it's hard to believe that at the time that this would be the one of the essential sparks, but in hindsight, it's hard to say that it wasn't. If you look at the history of the Boston Tea Party, we can go over that briefly here just to remind everyone. On March 5th, 1770, the Parliament had rescinded the townshend duties on 4 of 5 commodities that were being taxed at the ports. The duty on tea, however, remained in force. Again, the Townshend Acts were a series of British acts of Parliament passed during 1767 and 1768, introducing a series of taxes and regulations to fund the administration of the British colonies. It was named after the Chancellor of the Executive who proposed the programs. Now, mostly they're usually called the Townshend Acts. But they were absolutely very unpopular, and it led to the Boston Tea Party, which invariably leads to the American Revolution. And one of the key players in this endeavor was Sam Adams. He was heading the Sons of Liberty, and he was an essential actor in the American Revolution, as well as, certainly in the Boston Tea Party itself. And I think it's Thomas Jefferson who states that that Sam Adams was the essential figure to do with the Boston Tea Party. And I think that it really speaks volumes to how a boycott can lead to eventual collective actions in legislature. And it was Adams and the Correspondence Committees promoted the opposition to the Tea Act of 1773. In every colony except Massachusetts, protesters were able to force the tea consignees to resign or return the tea to England. In Boston, however, Governor Hutchinson was determined to hold his ground. He convinced the tea consignees, 2 of whom were his sons, not to back down. The Boston caucus and then the town meeting attempted to compel the consignees to resign, but they refused. With the tea ships about to arrive, Sam Adams and the Boston Committee of Correspondence contacted nearby committees to rally support. The tea ship Dartmouth arrived in Boston Harbor in late November, and Adams wrote a circular letter calling for a mass meeting to be held at Faneuil Hall on November 29. Thousands of people arrived, so many that the meeting was moved to the larger Old South Meeting House. British law required the Dartmouth to unload and pay duties within 20 days, or customs officials would confiscate the cargo. The mass meeting passed a resolution introduced by Adams urging the captain of the Dartmouth to send the ship back without paying the import duty. Meanwhile, the meeting assigned 25 men to watch the ship and prevent the tea from being unloaded. And there's a meeting that takes place there. But you get to the actual day of the Boston Tea Party. By December 15th, the Eleanor and the Beaver, also both laden with tea, arrive in Griffith's Wharf. The law is clear. If the duty on the Dartmouth tea is not paid by 17 December, the customs officer is authorized to seize the ship and the cargo. The governor, the ship's owners, and the tea consignees all refused to return the tea to England. Voting on December 16th, meeting at Old South, the body resolves to prevent the East India tea from being landed, stored, sold, or consumed. At the conclusion of the meeting, the crowd streams out onto the street, chasing 30 to 60 men dressed as Indians down to Griffin's Wharf in what John Adams would call an intrepid, quote, exertion of popular power. The men proceeded to dump 342 chests of tea into the sea. And this causes, kind of a massive series of dominoes to kind of fall into place, leading to the American Revolution. The Tea Act had been done on May 10, 1773. December 16, you have the Boston Tea Party. You fast forward a year later, we're starting to say no taxation without representation. In the 1774, the Continental Congress is convened. 1775, there's the battles of Lexington and Concord, because by then Parliament has closed the city's port in Boston in response to the Tea Party. So the Tea Party prompted a response from the British Parliament that invariably leads to independence. And it's going to lead to collective actions. It's going to be people not merely just throwing tea into the harbor. If all they had kept doing was boycotting the tea, not much would have changed. So eventually the colonists are getting around to, we need to convene the Continental Congress, 1774. And by 1776, they have the Congress, the Second Continental Congress, having the state, the colonies declare themselves to be free and independent states, and they're declaring independence. And so this kind of shows that a popular catalyst like a boycott can lead to very effective actions to achieve either policies that you favor, or in this case, it actually led to independence and more freedom for the American people. But if what's going on with the boycott though? Bud Light suffers bloodbath as longtime and loyal consumers revolt against transgender campaign. In Bud Light's effort to be inclusive, they excluded almost everybody else, says a St. Louis bar owner. And the sales, this is kind of anecdotal reports on sales across America at particular, breweries and pubs and restaurants, etc. Bud Light suffered a bloodbath this past weekend. This is Fox Business by Kerry Byrne. Consumers nationwide revolted against the nation's top-selling beer brand after it stepped recklessly into the culture wars last week with its new spokesperson, transgender TikTok star Dylan Mulvaney, according to bar owners and beer industry experts around the country. This is Jeff Fitter, owner of Case and Bucks. He says, quote, I think society flexes its muscles sometimes and reminds manufacturers that the consumer is still in charge. And Case and Bucks, they're based in Barnhart, Missouri, told Fox Business, quote, in Bud Light's effort to be inclusive, they excluded almost everybody else, including their traditional audience. I was mentioning that there's a core demographic for products like Anheuser-Busch, and they were kind of rejecting them. He cited sports fans, working people, and women as loyal Bud Light consumers the brand suddenly excluded in its race to go woke. Bud Light maker Anheuser-Busch is headquartered in nearby St. Louis, but even Fitter's Bar witnessed a catastrophic decrease in sales of the hometown suds among loyal and local consumers this week. Sales of Anheuser-Busch bottled products dropped 30% the past week, while draught beers plummeted 50%, the owner said at that particular restaurant. Similar stories, however, are found throughout the country. Bud Light normally outsells rival products Miller Lite and Coors Light 25-1 at Braintree Brewhouse in Massachusetts, a sprawling sports bar just outside of Boston. Hey, there's Boston again. Not this week. 80% of Bud Light drinkers ordered something else this week, Brewhouse owner Alex Caceres said, while the 20% who did order Bud Light weren't on social media and hadn't heard yet about its new transgender pitch person. They didn't order it again, he said, after other patrons told him about the Bud Light marketing misfire. One pub in Hell's Kitchen, a New York City neighborhood known for its large and vocal gay community, reported that Bud Light draft sales dropped 58% this week, while Bud Light bottle sales were down 70%. So clearly the boycott is kind of taking on a life of its own, and it is impacting, pretty urban areas that, maybe these aren't Republican strongholds. Boston, New York City, these are, Hell's Kitchen is not a Republican stronghold. So this is just sheer consumer backlash against something that they perceive that they don't support. And they don't, this is, they don't want me to, drink Bud Light anymore. So they're going to go boycott it. They're going to get something else. Bud Light's decision to dive into the culture wars was, quote, a bad decision that defied, quote, virtually every rule in building brands and marketing, a national beer industry analyst told Fox Business. He cited a nightmare scenario for Bud Light sales reps in Texas, where the brand has for years has sponsored a weekly dart league with 100 plus players each Thursday night. The bar typically sells, though, 3 kegs of Bud Light at the event, a total of 495 12-ounce pours. The bar sold only 4 12-ounce Bud Light bottles this week as the dart players held a mass protest against their league sponsor. They've already done enough damage in 1 week to disrupt year-long sales projections. A beer sales representative who works with national beer retailers such as Costco told Fox Business, quote, you don't just make up those sales. People aren't going to drink twice as much Bud Light of the following weekend to recover the lost business. Now, for a brand as large as Bud Light, the public relations calamity already represents millions of lost dollars, even if the consumer revolt ended tomorrow, which it isn't. Bud Light is famous for hiring the best marketing people in the business, the national sales rep said, but this time they hired the wrong person, he indicated. Now, what is going on with Anheuser-Busch? This is a quintessential, it's like over 170 years old, founded in 1852. But they're not owned by Americans anymore. They were bought out. They are now AB InBev. Anheuser-Busch InBev, also known as AB InBev, is a Belgian multinational drink and brewing company based in Leuven, Belgium. When did this happen? Anheuser-Busch was established in 1852, but in 2008, InBev announced that they were purchasing it. The division operated 12 breweries in the United States and 17 others overseas. Anheuser's best-known beers included brands such as Budweiser, Busch beers, and the Michelob families, Natural Ice, Light, and Ice. And there's actually a bunch of others as well. You have Budweiser, now AB InBev. They own a bunch of other brands as well. So you think about the boycott, people are focused on Bud Light, but there's this bigger parent company, AB InBev, that it owns Budweiser, yes, but they also own Corona, Stella Artois, Beck's, Hoegaarden, Leffe, see some others here, Becker, there's Bush down there, and just on down the line. So you could Michelob, so you could boycott. There's Rolling Rock. So they own quite a good chunk of the market share of just beer in general. So people might say, oh, I'm not going to buy, I'm not going to buy Bud Light this week. Okay, get me a Beck's or something, but they'd still be supporting the parent company. And so, consumers can focus, but they may not be particularly focused on just how many different brands of beer that this company actually owns. And so kind of leads to, okay, so what good can come out of the boycott if their bottom line's not going to be impacted too much? Yes, Bud Light's going to suffer. Maybe Budweiser will suffer as well. Probably seems likely. They share the same name. But going forward, like, is the boycott going to change the decision making at AB InBev? And that seems unlikely without other catalysts, things that will result in hopefully kind of collective action. So here is America First Legal. This is one of the foundations that's headed by Stephen Miller, former Trump advisor, former President Donald Trump. This is like one of his nonprofit organizations, has filed a civil rights complaint against Anheuser-Busch's racial and gender hiring quotas as a violation of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. And this is kind of where I wanted to lead you to in terms of what can be done to address not merely, Anheuser-Busch's, marketing campaigns. That's on the surface. There's a reason why these companies are all going woke, and also a lot of them are going green. There's a type of investment called environmental, social, and governance, ESG investing, that tries to achieve social and economic outcomes by using what is called the stakeholder capitalist model. So, on the environmental side, for example, you can have oil companies being taken over by green investors, as BlackRock has, been able to do with companies like ExxonMobil to basically lower oil production, raise prices, and therefore help the U.S. economy and the global economy to transition to non-oil brands. So they're not actually trying to sell oil; they want you to get off oil. So you get kind of the feeling that maybe these companies actually don't like, the type of investment here. Oh, wow, look at this, ESG and alcohol, invest responsibly. This is Focus Point, publication for professional investors, in-depth insights from NN Investment Partners. And this just talks about one of the so-called sin industries that ESG, they don't really like alcohol. So it kind of calls into question whether Anheuser-Busch was even trying to sell beer by taking on the transgender question. That's not their target audience is not, they may even be opposed to it if you think that it skews disproportionately Republican, for example, that the Republicans, they're deeply opposed to the transgender question. So are they even trying to sell beer, or would they be happy to see alcohol and beer kind of go away? Just like they're happy to see oil go away. I think that that's a significant possibility to consider as we kind of take a look at that. Here's the can of Dylan Mulvaney. This was a part of the marketing effort to, sell or not sell Bud Light, again, as the case may be. And here's my piece. America First Legal Foundation on April 17th, they filed a civil rights complaint against Anheuser-Busch at the Missouri branch of the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, alleging violations of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act's prohibition against employment discrimination on the basis of race and sex, blasting the company's racial and gender hiring quotas, stating, quote, Anheuser-Busch is knowingly, intentionally, and unlawfully discriminating based on race, color, national origin, and sex with respect to employment and training opportunities. And I wanted you to see the letter here. This is April 17, 2023. And this is by Nicholas Barry. He's an attorney at America First Legal Foundation. And you kind of go through this and you see, wait a second, there's more to Anheuser-Busch's kind of woke agenda than merely the marketing campaign. There are policies at place at this corporation, but largely many of the corporations who are trading under the ESG banner that result in things like Title VII violations of the Civil Rights Act, where they're going to have racial and gender hiring quotas. Let's go through these. Federal law forbids discrimination by an employer against an employee or potential employee, quote, because of such individual's race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And that's from the Civil Rights Act. Here it is, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. You're not allowed to do employment discrimination under the basis of race or sex under the Civil Rights Act, but that might be what's happening here. And so likewise, an employer cannot, quote, limit, segregate, or classify his employees or applicants in any way which would be deprive or tend to deprive any individual of employment opportunities or otherwise adversely affect his status as an employee because of such individual's race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Finally, it is unlawful employment practice for any employer to discriminate against any individual because of his race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in admission to or employment in any program established to provide apprenticeship or other training. And the evidence is that Anheuser-Busch is knowingly, intentionally, and unlawfully discriminating on the basis of race, color, national origin, and sex with respect to employment and job training opportunities. For example, the Anheuser-Busch Leadership Acceleration Program. You can find this on the on our website here. Here's the job listing from the Leadership Acceleration Program. Here's Anheuser-Busch. There's a full job description. And it is to fuel these efforts. We have launched, they're trying to do a wide range of experiences, a diverse team, critical to our success, they say. We have launched the Leadership Acceleration Program. This program provides formal mentorship, executive interaction, and leadership development curriculum for those who identify with historically underrepresented groups as they join our organization in a full-time capacity. We encourage candidates who identify as Black, Latinx, and Native American to apply, as well as those who identify with a historically underrepresented group. So here they have a job listing, and in order to qualify, you have to be Black, Latino, or Native American, or come from some other historically underrepresented group. Well, guess what? That violates Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, clear prohibition on employment discrimination. Now, the complaint comes on the heels of Anheuser-Busch's controversial marketing campaign by transgender activist Dylan Mulvaney that resulted in new scrutiny and boycotts of the 171-year-old beer manufacturer. The America First legal letter pointed to the Anheuser-Busch 2023 Leadership Accelerator Program. He says it's Nicholas Barry describes it as, quote, a fast track program to executive leadership positions at Anheuser-Busch, and it is limited to candidates based on race. The pro forma equal opportunity employer language at the end of the posting, it basically attempts to mask the company's discriminatory intent and purpose. But they also point to their ESG report, Anheuser-Busch's ESG report, America First Legal, where they outline further racial and gender hiring quotas: 22% of women in the overall workforce, 35% women in salaried workforce, 28% women in top 5 leadership levels, 14% in top 3 leadership level, 5 out of 15 board members are women. And you can see that here. It's their ESG report. And down here, this is on page 78 of the AB InBev 2022 ESG report. And there it is, 88%, the D&I index of annual employee engagement survey, 132 nationalities, 61 nationalities at global headquarters. And then you see there, 22% women in the workforce, etc. And so these are quotas, basically. And if you read their annual report, the corporate annual report from the Anheuser-Busch, AB InBev, they also outline this thing where they're pushing for diversity. They're going to have hiring quotas. AB InBev continues working to promote all aspects of diversity in its entire senior leadership, with a focus on building a diverse talent pipeline, considering relevant skills, education, experience, and background of the employees. The background is very important. This strategy continues to drive results. They're making results. They're hitting their quotas. For instance, while the representation of women on senior leadership team in the senior leadership level directly below the senior leadership team remained constant compared to the last reporting year, the overall representation of women in top leadership positions in our company grew by 2 percentage points compared to the last reporting year. So now here they're kind of talking about their quotas. As America First Legal noted, quote, Anheuser-Busch's annual report has a diversity, equity, and inclusion section almost entirely dedicated to the growth of only women in the workforce. Meanwhile, the company says in its ESG report that, quote, beer is inclusive. So here's a page from their ESG report. I took a screen still here. It says beer is inclusive, natural, and local. From thousands of farmers to millions of small retailers to colleagues and consumers, we strive to improve livelihoods and increase access to opportunity. Our inclusivity efforts extends to our products, going beyond an affordable and accessible category. We stand for better choices while also promoting moderation. So here you get kind of this anti-alcohol component of the ESG, kind of agenda there. So here you see Anheuser-Busch is now promoting. They're saying, "Oh, smart drinking in moderation," and that sounds about right. You don't want people getting drunk and getting into trouble, etc. But here's diversity, equity, and inclusion. But these are kind of contrary, I think, to what their core demographic is kind of expecting. What from Anheuser-Busch. And we note here that this runs afoul when you have diversity, racial, and gender hiring quotas like these. They appear to run afoul of the 1964 Civil Rights Act prohibition on employment discrimination. It shall be unlawful employment practice for an employer, quote, to fail to refuse to hire or discharge any individual or otherwise to discriminate against any individual with respect to his compensation, terms, conditions, or privileges of employment because of such individual's race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, or to limit, segregate, or classify as employees or applicants for employment in any way which would deprive or tend to deprive any individual of employment opportunities or otherwise adversely affect his status as an employee because of such individual's race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Now, that's the clear letter of the law. Unfortunately, Steelworkers v. Weber, 1979, the U.S. Supreme Court basically found the opposite. It was kind of an Orwellian decision, as we're going to find out here, which ruled that employment policies that racial preferences on the basis of race and sex in favor of women and minorities, which plaintiffs argued was reverse discrimination, were not a violation of the Civil Rights Act, in effect legalizing employment discrimination against whites and males. This was a sharp departure from a more racially neutral interpretations of the Civil Rights Act by federal courts that preceded the decision. And so much so that then Associate Justice William Rehnquist, who would go on to become the 16th Chief Justice in 1986, in his dissenting opinion on Steelworkers v. Weber, compared the court's rewriting of the Civil Rights Act to the totalitarian regime portrayed in George Orwell's 1984, writing that the law was plainly written, quote, taken in its normal meeting and as understood by all members of Congress who spoke to the issue during the legislative debates. This language prohibits a covered employer from considering race when making an employment decision, whether the race be black or white. Rehnquist blasted the majority of the court, adding, quote, the court behaves much like the Orwellian speaker described earlier, as if it had been handed a note indicating that Title VII would lead to a result unacceptable to the court if interpreted here as it was in our prior decisions. Now we are told that the legislative history of Title VII shows that employers are free to discriminate on the basis of race. An employer may, in the court's words, quote, trammel the interests of the white employees in favor of the black employees in order to eliminate, quote, racial imbalance. Our earlier interpretations of Title VII, like the banners and posters decorating the square in Oceana, were all wrong. So here you have a dissent by the great William Rehnquist in Steelworkers v. Weber in 1979. And could this issue now be revisited going forward? Well, it will take things like the America First legal's letter to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. It's going to start out as a complaint. You can wind up with lawsuits. And guess what? Anheuser-Busch isn't the only company that's doing this. KPMG did a survey of publicly traded companies, and about 82% of them were touting ESG-like sustainability goals. How many of them are using diversity, racial, and gender hiring quotas that are trying to say, oh, we have to hire more people of this race or this sex in order to meet what we perceive to be the proper, equitable distribution, racial and sex and gender distribution of our employees. You're not hiring under the basis of merit. You're hiring under the basis of background and ethnicity and sex and gender. So it's going to take, I think, complaints like this. So this is a kind of a template. Could other foundations do stuff like this? Sure. Who can really get involved are the state attorneys general who are already taking on ESG as it relates to energy, alleging antitrust violations. Well, here's the Title VII, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. You're going to have clear violations in many of these publicly traded companies that are pursuing this agenda. And you can go against that. You can say, no, we're going to enforce the law. We're going to enforce Title VII, as America First is advocating for here. President Trump's organization there. Now, 44 years after Steelworkers v. Weber's decision, we are seeing the outcome of corporate and business hiring practices that now fully favor reverse discrimination as a means to achieving perceived equity and inclusion, and as a means of securing ESG investment, which grew to $8.4 trillion, according to the Forum of Sustainable and Responsible Investment. That's still here. Here it is. Sustainable Investing Assets 2022. Here's ESG Incorporation. You can see here it's $8,400 billion or $8.4 trillion nationwide. Much of it is by money managers on behalf of individual and retail investors, about $916 billion. A huge chunk of it, $6.6 trillion, is actually by institutional investors, and then about $2.1 trillion are overlapping strategies, so-called. So that's a massive amount of investment. Now, most of that's going into environmental stuff, green investing, et cetera. But the social part of ESG is going to be focused on the diversity and inclusion agenda, which is, I think, what we're encountering here. So the majority of the Supreme Court today are all considered acolytes of Rehnquist. All were regarded as constitutionalists, originalists, and textualists when they were nominated by conservative presidents George Herbert Walker Bush, George W. Bush, and Donald Trump, the latter of whom just secured a historic 6-3 majority on the nation's highest court with Justices Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett. So today, the question of reverse discrimination posed by ESG's diversity and inclusion corporate policies might be decided differently by today's Supreme Court more than 40 years later. It would be up to those fired or canceled to make the case they were discriminated against under the basis of race and or sex. Or the state attorneys general, they can argue on behalf of their citizens, saying that here's some clear examples in their state of companies who just the sheer, the hiring policies by, like the Leadership Accelerator Program. Missouri attorneys general could get involved in that question there. And so there's a clear approach legally, I think, to take on some of this. This is exactly, by the way, the Title VII approach that this author, me, advocated for in February to more broadly address ESG's violations in retirement investment of not just civil rights laws, but also antitrust. Here I was commenting on former President Trump. He's running for president again in 2024. And he was saying he's going to do a ESG executive order. He wants to get rid of it. And so I tried to lay out a methodology for doing so. And I can kind of briefly touch on some of the points here. Now, the Labor Department has addressed this in the past. Here's the 8.4 trillion figure of ESG investing in the United States right now. And you can look at changes to the Employment, Retirement, Income Security Act regulations by the U.S. Labor Department in 2015. But that actually was preceded by Clinton administration regulations. You have a 2020 regulation by the Trump Labor Department that talks about ESG investing. There was also a 2008 regulation by the George W. Bush Labor Department. And a 1994 regulation by the Bill Clinton administration. And so these are all revisions of one another. And now there's a 2022 regulation by the Biden Labor Department. So you have the Bush Labor Department and the Bush Labor Department and the Trump Labor Department are kind of watering down ESG a bit. And then the Biden regulation is going to put it and make it more prominent in the investments. Now, here's the thing. The amount of investing going into ESG and into retirement accounts, that is only about 1/3 of these 30, or a bit more than 1/3, about 35 to 37% are actually in the are in employer-based retirement plans regulated under ERISA. The rest of it's going to be in individual retirement plans. And so that makes a big difference. If you're going to have another huge chunk of this investing For example, here's another chunk though. You have 714 billion thrift savings plan, the federal employee retirement plan. Trump did stop the thrift savings plan from making similar kinds of investments. But now in 2022, Joe Biden has just given the federal employees the green light to go and make green investments. So so the rules by the Labor Department can't fully impact what's going to happen at the thrift savings plan, not the individual retirement accounts. That's 11.7 trillion individual retirement accounts. There's the 10 trillion in state and local government retirements. We mentioned the thrift savings plan. You also have ESG investing by state governments in California, New York, Colorado, Maine, Maryland, and Oregon. So in other words, the Labor Department rule only touches employer-based plan, defined benefit, and defined contribution plans, which total about 11.9 trillion currently to defined benefit and contribution plans, only making up about 36.8% of the $32 trillion retirement savings market. Therefore, the Labor Department is not exclusively an appropriate vehicle for addressing ESG. It is required, but it can only ever address a little more than 1/3 of the problem. Assuming Republican administration officials and a future Trump or DeSantis or somebody else's administration even truly view this as a problem that needs addressing. So the problem with the Labor Department regulation also is it applies what's called an all things being equal test. Every single one of the regulations put forward by the Labor Department, starting in 2008 by Bush, but then by Obama, and then by Trump, and now by Biden. They all apply this all things being equal test. Now, the Biden and the Obama rule will go even further and say, if it's a non-pecuniary factor, you can take it into consideration under ERISA, even though ERISA is really talking about pecuniary factors. What the Bush and Trump rules said was you can consider ESG, but it has to be affecting the bottom line of a company, such that it then could be considered. So the Bush and Trump rules didn't actually ban ESG for defined benefit and defined contribution plans. It watered down the Obama regulation a bit, and the push for ESG, and made it more optional on the fund managers to make this determination. But there's a lot of discretion there. Now, this has a lot to do, I think, with the what you can really do under ERISA. ERISA says it has to be, these are fiduciary standards, the prudent man standard. So if you apply the all things equal test, all things being equal, as long as the company's profitable, they can do whatever ESG they want. That's kind of what they're saying there. So we think that Americans for Limited Government, they need to go further. And maybe the Labor Department isn't the best mechanism to address this. Maybe Title VII is, maybe Civil Rights Act. When you see Civil Rights Act violations, you can look at it from that perspective. So when you look at it, ESG has been insanely profitable for both companies and investors, but not in a good way. Look at U.S. oil companies. The largest oil producers do not appear to have plans to increase production through 2025. A review of U.S. Energy Information Agency data and corporate reports of U.S.-based oil companies reveals, despite oil prices topping $120 per barrel and inflation hitting 9% in 2022. According to EIA, U.S. oil production reached 12 million barrels per day in 2022 and will reach 12.6 million barrels per day in 2023, a return to pre-COVID production levels. So this year we're supposed to finally get back to 2019 levels. It's 2023 now. We're finally getting back to 2019 production levels. Wow. But what about over the long term? Look at top U.S. oil producers reveals that these companies have been pivoting away from carbon-based energy for years. In short, they're going green. In 2021, ExxonMobil, the largest producer in the U.S., announced that it would produce 3.7 million barrels a day, about 18% of all U.S. consumption from its facilities throughout the world, a level which would remain relatively unchanged through 2025. So they're not really increasing by all that much. Long term, ExxonMobil reports in its 2020 report that they were positioning, quote, for a lower carbon energy future. Does this sound like something that's in the oil company's interest to go to a lower carbon energy future? I think that goes against their core demographic, oil consumers, motor vehicles. If they're positioning for a lower carbon future, that means they're working against their own interest as an oil company. Quote, working to develop breakthrough solutions in areas such as carbon capture, biofuels, hydrogen, and energy efficiency, process technology that can help achieve the Paris Climate Accords. Geez. Okay. According to ExxonMobil President Neil Chapman speaking on March 2022 to investors, quote, "We will reduce the emissions in our existing operations. We're aiming for net zero scope 1 and scope 2 emissions at our operated facilities by 2050. And in the US, Exxon's net zero plans will be attained on the Permian Basin by 2030. Now, BlackRock, we mentioned them. They have placed green activists on to ExxonMobil to make it basically a not oil company, thanks to ESG. Other hedge funds like Vanguard also make significant ESG investments. As for Chevron, they're not increasing much production either. It currently produces about 3 million barrels a day, and it's expected to rise by just 500,000 barrels per day by 2025. And they say that they're also in their corporate annual report in 2020, they stated, quote, they want, quote, higher returns and a lower carbon future, reducing the carbon intensity of our operations and assets, prioritizing the projects that return the largest reduction in carbon emissions at the lowest cost to consumers and society, et cetera, et cetera. And they plan to be net zero carbon emitter by 2050. But this has led to catastrophe, to slowdown of production, besides making Europe and the West increasingly dependent on energy from adversaries like Russia. Inflation is on fire. Thanks to the energy crisis, even major environmental criteria investment beneficiaries like, that's an ESG beneficiary. Tesla CEO Elon Musk was calling for an increase in oil and gas production in a bid to offset Russia. On March 2022, he stated, quote, hate to say it, but we need to increase oil and gas output immediately. Extraordinary times demand extraordinary measures. Now, these are all explicit ESG goals being pursued by the largest oil companies in the U.S., particularly goals to support the Paris Climate Accords and to reduce carbon emissions to zero. In both companies' cases, the strategies short-term include deploying carbon capture, more investment. Long-term, they're sealing the fate of carbon-based energies by embracing an investment model that calls for their extinction. So again, I question whether, the marketing push for, kind of transgender on Anheuser-Busch, are they even trying to sell beer? It doesn't sound like the oil companies want to sell oil. They want to get rid of oil. So maybe they don't like beer and they want it to go away. They think it's harmful in some way, or promotes toxic masculinity or something like that. Go back to the other piece here. Ultimately, this will mean less oil production, and yet by restricting the U.S. oil supply, oil companies make more money. It's that simple. It is more profitable for the green cartel to act as a cartel. In fact, Exxon in 2022 posted more than double the profits it did in 2021, growing from 23 billion profits annually to 55.7 billion profits annually, which is more than 2008's 45.2 billion. By restricting oil supplies, oil companies like Exxon posted record profits. So this is what shows you why the fiduciary model on the Labor Department regulation side, the prudent man standard, might actually advise for Exxon to engage in cartel-like behavior. So how do you get around this? The get woke, go broke is kind of a big lie. If ExxonMobil is going green and they're making record profits, yes, get woke, go broke is probably a big lie. But a comforting one for Republicans, conservatives, and libertarians will undoubtedly continue to tell themselves that the market's invisible hand is going to intervene and take this thing out any minute now. So you can go to the boycotts going on in against Bud Light, and you can say, well, okay, yeah, we're gonna boycott this, and they're gonna suffer a bloodbath, get woke, go broke, right? But did they remember to boycott all the other brands that Anheuser-Busch owns? Corona, Stella Artois, Beck's, and on down the line. There's more to, I think, trying to achieve an outcome against this kind of ESG agenda than merely working on the boycott side. You can have a catalyst like a boycott, but it needs to lead to collective actions, as they did in the road towards independence. They had to convene continental congresses. I'm pointing a need here to deal with regulations and laws that impact ESG investments. And we're noting that these policies, ESG policies by these corporations, could be violating Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. So there's enforcement of existing laws that could be done to kind of rein this in. So this is a comforting, thought, though. Get woke, go broke, right? Well, not always. Ineffective fiduciary rules for retirement plans that only impact a third of the market could save us, they promise, but maybe they won't. Besides the fact that these are not anything close to free markets at all, the all things being equal test by the Labor Department, even if it were applied to every retirement account in America, would do almost nothing to stop this. Energy abundance would drive the price of oil down and might be less profitable. So producing more oil will reduce prices. So it does the prudent man standard. Will you make more money with ESG and restricting energy production, or by producing lots of energy and reducing the price of oil in the United States? Sounds like it might be more profitable to restrict the oil supply the way OPEC is doing right now. They're driving up the price of oil by restricting production. Well, that's what the green cartel wants to do too, and then use it to transition away from oil entirely and make oil go extinct as a form of energy. Which will almost certainly, even in the current market downturn, which is almost certainly caused by ESG's bid for production slowdowns that caused the inflation in the first place, will be felt across the board to ESG and non-ESG companies alike, likely making it impossible for our fiduciaries to discern who did better during the imminent recession that we're fearing right now. Besides, fiduciaries are not supposed to make considerations such as, quote, what if everyone buys into ESG and bad things happen overall and America is weakened? By definition, those are non-pecuniary considerations under the law, and the Labor Department under Republicans seeks to avoid, even while seemingly allowing it. The real problem here is the discretion that is allowed. Sorry, I had a audio come online there. Just suddenly when those ads pop up and they start talking, it can be very distracting. The real problem here is the discretion that is allowed under the law, which almost certainly needs to be tightened up by Congress under its Article 1, Section 8 power to regulate commerce. Simply put, we do not want our nation's energy independence, but also, civil rights, hiring policies to be dependent on pencil neck fiduciaries who will only ever interpret federal regulations and bottom lines and have every financial interest in pursuing these perverse incentives and subsidies. The dirty secret is these perverse incentives and subsidies do benefit investors. And Trump's right in his video when he says that these radical left-wing policies are destroying countries. But this is a perverse incentive that ESG poses on constraining U.S. energy production. And it wasn't lost on former Arizona Attorney General Mark Brnovich and former Nebraska Attorney General Doug Peterson and 17 other Republican attorneys general that threatened the $10 trillion hedge fund BlackRock with antitrust legal action in the August 4, 2022 letter to BlackRock CEO Larry Fink, accusing the company of, quote, intentionally restraining and harming the competitiveness of energy markets with its market dominance of retirement accounts. They added, quote, coordinated conduct with other financial institutions to impose net zero carbon emissions by 2050 raises antitrust concerns. Group boycotts, restraining trade, or concerted refusals to deal, quote, clearly run afoul of Section 1 of the Sherman Act, according to the Supreme Court. Section 1 prohibits, quote, every combination or conspiracy and restraint of trade or commerce. Regarding the definition of combination, the Supreme Court has held that this language clearly prohibits concerted action. So here, Brnovich, Peterson, and the other GOP attorneys general were laying out a case that the push for net zero carbon emissions through coordinated efforts with investment banks via ESG and funds to restrict the flow of capital to carbon-based energies like oil and coal are engaged in a type of anti-competitive collusion prohibited by federal antitrust laws. So this tells us that there's another legal component. There's an existing federal law against antitrust. You're not allowed to do anti-competitive. You're not allowed to have cartels. You're not allowed to restrict production in a bid to boost prices and gouge consumers and people at the pump. So you can use Antitrust, the federal Justice Department could be doing that. The U.S. Justice Department Antitrust Division could be enforcing antitrust laws against ESG right now for restricting energy production in a bid to drive up prices and gouge consumers. The U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division could be using Title VII to go at employers who are engaged in racist hiring practice and sexist hiring practices that favor one group, one race over another race, one sex over another sex, one gender over another gender, etc. So what else could you do though? You could impose upon retirement accounts. This is what I call for. Again, 82% of US corporations are touting ESG sustainability goals. So there's a huge body of companies that have already bought into this, even though doing so by no means guarantees inclusion in hedge funds, ESG funds like BlackRock and Vanguard. ESG is so successful in shifting companies to the stakeholder capitalism model that companies are adopting ESG goals of their own accord in a mere hope of getting some of that investment money by virtue signaling, basically, without necessarily even boosting their company's overall capitalization. It's like trying to boost your odds of winning the lottery by promoting the lottery. It doesn't quite work that way. BlackRock BlackRock CEO Larry Fink, he in his annual shareholder letter to investors in 2022, he said that the events and the inflation and the supply crisis would lead to the green energy future. Quote, longer term, I believe that recent events will actually accelerate the shift towards greener sources of energy in many parts of the world. Here he's admitting that the higher prices and gouging consumers and the green cartel-like behavior are designed to exploit the inflation and then use it to get rid of oil altogether. Particularly the inflation of carbon-based energy would make green more price competitive. Quote, higher energy prices will also meaningfully reduce the green premium for clean technologies and enable renewables, EVs, and other clean technologies to be more competitive economically, Fink said. As a result, the ESG could be worth 41 trillion this year globally. That's different than the 8.4 trillion figure that we were looking at earlier. That's from a different organization, USSIF. But leaving aside that nuance, this is reported by Bloomberg, 50 trillion by 2025. On the other hand, USSIF referenced above actually lowered its perspective on what truly constitutes ESG investing. It previously stated that the United States stake in ESG totaled 17 trillion, but now they're saying 8.4 trillion. They want to discount things, so-called double counting or greenwashing as well, where companies are pretending to be one thing, but they're not actually partaking in the ESG religion. Now, leaving us, and I think it is kind of like a cult, leaving aside disputes about what is and what is not ESG, this dispute is actually being used as a basis for Securities and Exchange Commission to impose and enforce ESG on publicly traded corporations in a June 2022 proposed regulation by the Biden administration. And therefore, how large it actually is. There are other laws that ESG openly breaks. We mentioned Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. We go through all of the discrimination in employment and hiring. We've noted that companies like AT&T, they promoted the diversity and inclusion agenda when they were purchasing Warner Media. Disney, they were doing it too. So you see Disney doing this push on kind of woke. Mattel, they're toy companies, Discovery, they now control Warner Media. And some thought that, oh, maybe this will mean a push away from ESG, but it's like, no, they do diversity and inclusion in their agenda as well. So does Hasbro and on down the line. It's not just the entertainment industry. We can see this publicly promoted in media, in ad campaigns like the Budweiser, who's, by the way, is they're responding by trotting out the Clydesdale. They're like, oh, they didn't, our marketing push really was kind of backfired. It's harming sales. Let's put the horse ad out again and act all patriotic, and that will fix it, right? Maybe not, though. Maybe they've done kind of irreparable or long-term damage to the Anheuser-Busch brand. So Budweiser is and Bud Light are going to take a huge hit But can they squeak on by with Corona and Stella Artois and Beck's and other brands of beer that AB InBev still owns? That's a question. Do people know they need to boycott those things as well if they're going to impact the bottom line of AB InBev? But it's not just the entertainment industry. It's not just the beer industry. Here's Pfizer, March 2021 ESG report. They also set 2025, quote, opportunity parity goals, including, quote, increasing our minority representation from 19 to 32% and doubling the underrepresented population of African Americans, Blacks, and Hispanic Latinos. So those are racial hiring quotas, and they violate Title VII. And on down the line, 2020, we see Twitter, before Elon Musk purchased it, it wasn't just used for D&I, it used for racial and gender hiring quotas. It was actually used for censorship in Twitter. In 2020, Twitter's ESG report declared that it would, quote, not amplify the speech of some on their platform. Quote, freedom of speech is a fundamental human right, but freedom to have that speech amplified by Twitter is not. Our rules exist to promote healthy conversations. Also, quote, we aim to strike an appropriate balance between empowering freedom of expression and creating a safe service for participatory public conversation. In other words, some users would have more freedom of expression than others, as Elon Musk, and then now he's allowed journalists like Matt Taibbi, Schellenberger, and others to access the so-called Twitter files to show that there was not merely censorship and algorithms that would impact some voices over others, but that there was actually coordination with the Department of Homeland Security, Cybersecurity, Infrastructure and Security Agency, also the FBI's Foreign Intelligence Task Force, to censor American people's speech, but also political campaigns. Also the reporting of things like the Hunter Biden laptop story, that there's a push for censorship, and it's related to this ESG. Their diversity and inclusion, the reason they're censoring some information and postings and social media accounts is to favor some voices over others on the question of things like transgender. And then now Elon Musk has just lifted those restrictions, or things that were favoring certain sides of certain conversations on social issues on Twitter. And he's moving more towards a freedom of speech kind of merit-based platform there. And it's going to take a long time too. There's so many problems over there. He's dealing with Tesla. He's dealing with SpaceX. He doesn't have all the time in the world to devote to fixing Twitter, but just gives you an idea of just how influential ESG is. It can impact beer producers. It can impact the energy industry. It could impact the pharmaceutical industry. We noted Pfizer there, and on down the line. It can impact everything. Nearly 300 companies recently, no less pernicious in 2021, nearly 300 companies, including NBC, Paramount, Sony, Google, Twitter, Facebook. Twitter's probably off the list now under new ownership. Apple, Intuit, Microsoft, Adobe, Amazon, AT&T, T-Mobile, almost all of the big banks. They signed a joint letter stating, quote, we are deeply concerned by the bills being introduced in state houses across the country that single out LGBTQ individuals, many specifically targeting transgender youth for exclusion or differential treatment. Laws that would affect access to medical care for transgender people, parental rights, social and family services, student sports, or access to public facilities such as restrooms, unnecessarily and uncharitably single out already marginalized groups for additional disadvantage. It goes on, these statements are all in favor of, quote, access to medical care for transgender people, including for, quote, transgender youth. So basically they're supporting, transgender surgeries on underage minors and children. I think that's wrong. I think most Republicans are opposed to that. They want to pass bills at the state level that's going to probably ban that or severely restrict it. Look at all the companies that are signing on to this letter. It absolutely is, it's 300 companies that include pretty much everything you're using. Use Microsoft for anything. Oh, maybe your computer. Use Apple or Google. Maybe your smartphones. Using Facebook. Maybe you're watching this on YouTube right now. Maybe you watch NBC. Maybe you have a TV subscription that automatically has NBC on it. Maybe you like to watch Paramount. They have they're signing on to this. Most of these major companies, because of ESG, this was a human rights campaign letter that they had signed on to, but because of their metrics, they want to say, yeah, we're into that. We support that agenda. So that's what happens here with Anheuser-Busch when they're promoting, their ESG goals. They're going to say, oh yeah, we're diverse, we're inclusive, we're doing the racial and gender hiring quotas. And so they can issue statements in favor of the transgender question as well. And so this can impact so many things. Former Disney actress Gina Carano, she spoke. She was targeted. She was on The Mandalorian because she didn't want to use pronouns in her Twitter biography. She also spoke out against COVID lockdowns and shared a warning against dehumanizing your neighbors under the basis of their political or religious beliefs, as it might lead to genocides. When you're dehumanizing your neighbors, you don't view them as people. She was warning about. She was basically saying never again when it comes to things like the Holocaust. And she felt that conservatives, and I think, just regular Americans are being discriminated against and they're being dehumanized. So either you talk the talk on diversity and inclusion, or there is no place for you, meaning the publicly traded corporations that accept ESG monies, you toe the line or you're out. That's what happened to Carano. More broadly, ESG supports policies that include critical race theory training in corporate environments. In 2021, Fox Business's Tyler O'Neill reported major corporations had woke trainings exposed in 2021. Quote, writing, Disney, Coca-Cola, American Express, Bank of America, Lowe's, and Pfizer faced accusations that they trained employees on certain, quote, woke ideas, such as putting, quote, marginalized staff above privileged staff, learning to decolonize their minds, and combating aspects of alleged, quote, white supremacy culture, such as perfectionism, individualism, and objectivity. These ideas trace back to critical race theory, a framework that involves deconstructing aspects of society to discover systemic racism beneath the surface. Current and former employees at American Express told Fox News that the change began after the police-involved killing of George Floyd in May 2020, but the woke trainings came to light in 2021. Now, I could go on and on about this. So what can we do about this? What are the concerted actions that a boycott of something like Budweiser? What good can come of a boycott, and what actions can actually be taken? And I have a list here now. Congress, the Labor Department, the Federal Thrift Savings Plan, and states should ban any investment into retirement plans by companies that are violating Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. Congress has explicit power under the 14th Amendment to pass laws guaranteeing equal protection of the law. And also under Article 1, Section 8, to regulate commerce, diversity and inclusions, racial and gender hiring quotas are an explicit flagrant violation of federal laws. Also state laws. So state Republican attorneys general should enforce those laws on companies in their states. In addition, state legislatures can put in place prohibitions for investments, not merely for public pensions in ESG, but private retirement accounts as well. Congress has explicit power under the 14th Amendment to pass laws that guarantee equal protection. It's about time they were enforced. State Republican attorneys general might also wish to challenge Labor Department, SEC, IRS, and state rules that explicitly allow for diversity and inclusion, racial and gender hiring quotas as an ESG factor in violation of Title VII, along with the Securities and Exchange Commission's rulemakings that will enforce ESG on companies that don't go along with those policies. The SEC is attempting to make certain that companies that tout ESG are sticking to what they say. Why are illegal racial and gender hiring quotas being incentivized by federal regulations? Perhaps state attorneys general should ask the Supreme Court if it's even allowed. Similarly, the Congress, Labor Department, Federal Thrift Savings Plan, that's the federal employee retirement account, and states should ban any investment by retirement plans into companies that are violating federal and state antitrust laws by engaging in divestment from U.S. carbon energy production. That's what ESG is doing. That we still need carbon energy, though. Prices are going to the moon. American people are getting price gouged at the gas pump, and that violates antitrust. It's leading to inflation and favoring green companies. This collusion, it is collusion, and it's illegal. Congress has explicit power to craft antitrust legislation under Article 1, Section 8's power to regulate commerce. It's about time those were enforced, too. Now, finally, you could also raise taxes on anything you want. Your Congress, you can raise taxes. The saying goes, when you want more of something, you subsidize it. And when you want less of it, you could tax it. Republicans in Congress could rescind wind production and solar tax credits, but they could also go much, much further when it comes to the ESG question. Tax deferment for retirement savings is optional. Congress doesn't have to allow for tax deference under retirement savings. Both Congress and the IRS could explicitly ban tax deferment for 401ks, individual retirement accounts, IRAs, etc., into investments that violate either Title VII of the Civil Rights Act and federal antitrust laws. They could, pass a rule, say we're going to. So when Trump does an executive order, should he be reelected again, he could issue the executive order saying we're going to impose Title VII and antitrust laws. We're going to use that enforcement mechanisms under those and say no retirement investment into companies that are violating these laws, or no tax deference for retirement investments that are violating these laws. A future president and state governors can also issue executive orders executing the above suggestions in their relevant jurisdictions by barring government and private retirement funds from investing in companies that brag about violating federal and state antitrust and civil rights laws. It's quite simple. ESG violates federal and state antitrust and civil rights laws. It's time to enforce the law. No more excuses, no more wishful thinking. It does not matter what Republicans' past failures, by the way, on this issue have been. What matters is what we do about it now. Yes, ban it, Mr. President, Congress, and state Republican governors before it's too late. This is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government, dailytorch.com. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell for notifications, and have a good day. But we're going to look at the chat first. I'm sure you're all very angry about what's going on in this country right now. Yeah, chat's on fire here. So we'll just start at the top. We can come out of this too. All right. Patricia Schenkel. Good thing I don't drink. Yeah, maybe wine's better anyways. Chris Zinda, thou thus protest too much. Okay. Ronnie Smith. It takes some people a long time to realize that. Richard Lee, that won't work at all. I know I tried to have you call the ones out of power in front of the American people. Okay, want some tribunals there. Let's see, Alan Windsor. This explains why my English breakfast tea costs so much. LOL. Yeah, talking about the Boston Tea Party. Well, that was a long time ago. Obviously, I think we've kind of patched things up with the Brits ever since then. Let's see. Sherry Wessler, we need to understand that while we are laughing at Anheuser-Busch, Tampax, Nike, and Springsteen going down like an explosion, this is how we get our country back without a single shot or arrest. Stop buying or using products from all services, sports, businesses, etc., that condone and perpetuate these things. It will take less than a week. The country and the government will shut down. We have to unite in solidarity. But yeah, I was just noting that 2021 letter from about 300 major companies that are all supporting, or actually opposing state laws that would ban transgender surgeries for minors and children. And that's including Google, that's including Apple. So I guess you have to boycott your smartphones. That includes Microsoft. I guess you have to throw your computer in the garbage. You're not allowed to use your computer anymore because it operates on Microsoft Windows. And on down the line. I mean, all of the entertainment you're consuming right now is likely coming from these companies that support this. Like Disney, has everyone canceled Disney yet? I don't think so. Did they stop going to the theme parks? Will they even ever post a loss? These companies are massive. You're talking about huge corporations. Like, is AB InBev, are they ever going to post a loss? An actual loss to their company's bottom line. Now, will Bud Light sales go down? Sure. And they are going down in the localities. Fox Business is reporting. We'll see what the corporate quarterly figures show if there's a huge hit on that particular brand. But does it harm the overall company's bottom line? Do they change their policies? Yeah, they're going to go back to putting the Clydesdale horse ad out there. The traditional Budweiser ad, and try to say we're patriotic and rah-rah, and you might not go back and buy Budweiser anymore, even if they do that. But will the company's policies change? Will the boycott be enough? Was the Boston Tea Party enough If all the revolutionaries had done was just keep throwing tea in the harbor and just doing boycotts, I don't think that the American Revolution would have amounted to much. No, it required convening the Continental Congress. Sam Adams, he was instrumental in the question of independence. Thomas Jefferson said Samuel Adams is the man who was leading the revolution. That he was kind of like the point of the spear there. He was the one getting them to throw the tea into the harbors. But then at the Continental Congress, he was instrumental in convincing the colonies to declare statehood, to declare independence. And so it took collective actions in legislature. And I've just advocated a bunch of actions that state legislatures, state governors, but also President of the United States, and the agencies, the regulations that could be undertaken, executive orders. Trump saying he wants to do an ESG executive order. There are civil society solutions to these problems when you have problems like that. Yes, we want to support the boycotts, but you need to channel that energy so that when interest dies down in this issue, that there's still a concerted plan going forward that will get you to where you want to be. You want to take out you want to take out ESG, you're going to have to consider what steps legally it might take. Lawsuits are going to be necessary. Laws, rules, regulations against antitrust and civil rights violations are going to be necessary. Otherwise, it's just a marketing push, right? It's like, oh, they did the wrong ad. Now they have the right ads and we support Bud again. I don't think so. I rule Taliaferro. It's Anheuser-Busch now. Let's see. Sam Abbo. I hate Bud Light. Gina McGonigal. Hi from Kentucky. Hello from Fairfax, Virginia here. Let's see. Johnny Walker Blue Label is the best, says Sam Abbo. Let's see here. Oh, Stella Artois, very good brand, beer, a very yummy good beer from this brand. I tested it. Okay. Stella Artois, they're owned by AB InBev. So if you switch from Bud Light to Stella Artois, you're still going to be feeding the bottom line of this company. So you're going to have to be a bit more savvy as a consumer for the boycott to have the impact that that you would hope that it would have. Jesse Garza, Trump 2024. Sam Abbo, Miller Draft. Yes, Miller is not owned by Anheuser-Busch, so maybe Miller would be a good alternative. It could be Miller time. I rule Taliaferro, Trump. All right, let's see. Silver Kimasabi. I like this, and I'm stealing it like a pair of Air Jordans during the most peaceful protest. Paula Arand. We love you, President Trump. You are for the people. All right, let's keep on going on here. Donald Lester. This is nothing but a lie. So tell your oil it is not fossil fuel. They're lying about its so-called pollution. Well, whether it's polluting or not, it seems like we need oil to fuel our cars and to, fuel our military, frankly. And we're not going to fully transition, I think, away from petroleum anytime soon. Even Elon Musk, who produces electric vehicles, saying we need more oil and gas production. Desperate times call for desperate measures. We're almost to the bottom here. Richard Pullman. They're trying to make us into them, and it isn't going to happen. Time to show resistance more than ever before. Yes, yes, boycotts. You want to protest, obviously do so peacefully. And that way nobody's going to get into any trouble. But what you want to see that energy from a boycott being able to translate into policies that will take on some of these issues. Otherwise, it might not amount to much. So America First Legal, they have their complaint into the EEOC, U.S. EEOC of Missouri, alleging Title VII civil rights violations by Anheuser-Busch. And you can take on the ESG question, which is what's really pushing all of this. On very, very strongly, and I think can be very, very effective mechanisms. And we've talked about antitrust, that there's violations there as well. and the U.S. Justice Department, if there's another Republican administration, maybe they could take that on too. But you have to identify what the problems are, and then you're going to know what to ask your elected representatives to do. So simply saying, we don't like this, we boycott it, it might not amount to much. DNC, completely unlawful, evil. People need to wake up for once. This is Richard Pullman. Well, this is not merely, again, just a partisan issue. You can have a problem on a bipartisan basis when it comes to some of these rulemakings. The Bush and Trump Labor Departments didn't exactly get rid of ESG. So again, you have to identify what the problems are, and then you need to let the policymakers know, all things being equal test, maybe the Labor Department isn't the most effective vehicle with which to deal with ESG. Maybe we should look at Title VII civil rights violations. Maybe we should look at federal antitrust laws the state Republican attorneys general are doing right now in federal courts. These are questions that can be posed to the courts, but they also need to be posed to the agencies. You can do this at the state level as well. They have civil rights laws as well. And you can identify companies that are engaged in, discriminatory hiring practices under the basis of race, sex, and gender. And I think that that's what it's going to take to, effectively, take these issues on going forward. And with that, I'll sign off. This is Robert Romano, Vice President of Public Policy with Americans for Limited Government, dailytorch.com. Thank you for listening. Hit that subscribe button, ring the bell for notifications, and have a good day.